For the past few days, I've been working on an article about truth seeking. The motivation for writing this article is particularly recent events, recent global events in America and also the UK, but events that really make us question what is truth seeking? What does it mean to be a truth seeker? Now, if you're interested in Mind That Ego, if you've followed me for some time, or if you're new to the videos and the content that I produce, you'll know that my definition of truth seeking will be looking at relative universal truths, spiritual truths, the kind of truths that are transcendent, the kind of truths that apply no matter what creed, no matter what race, no matter what gender, no matter what belief system you have. We're not taught necessarily that we can access truth, that truth is a direct experience, yet on the spiritual path, that's exactly what it is. It's an experience of truth. It's a sensation of pure awareness that dissolves all falsehood. It dissolves the mental concepts, it dissolves the distortions in the way that we usually view the world. So in the article, and what I'd like to discuss in this video, is the importance of distinguishing between spiritual truths and narrative truths. Now, the reason I define the other form of truth as a narrative truth is because when we make sense of the world and when we try and create an understanding of how we relate and our place in this universe, a lot of the time we will do so through story. The ego is a story about who we are. The beliefs that we have then can become part of our identity. So when we believe in something strongly, we allow it to oxygenize the ego identity. Now, this isn't a bad thing. It's not to say that all conceptual or narrative stories are bad. They create structure. They create cohesion and understanding between huge groups of people. Now, you just look at the concept of a nation. This in itself is a concept that we buy into. The trouble is, truth in the form of narrative is really hard, if not impossible, to define, or to at least arrive at a definitive, conclusive answer. When we look for truth in a narrative, we have to understand that all narratives to some degree are an assumption. There are factual events that happen, and there's no dispute in that. But in the reality, in the day-to-day, those factual events create a huge, infinite amount of assumptions. And it's the assumptions that come from the distortions, comes from the individual perception of those events that creates a narrative. The trouble is, you can have two people that look at factual events and perceive them differently. It's not to say that we cannot arrive at a really great, precise, logical and reasoned narrative truth. But it does mean that that is just the best way of describing a certain chain of events or a stance or a belief or a system. To emphasize this point, we can view this quest, this search for a narrative truth, much like a detective. We can use a detective archetype or even a journalist archetype. I study journalism, it's my background, so I'm also trained in how to uncover facts and how to report a story, right? Now what you want to do is you want to get as accurate as you can. And I am talking here mostly on a wider scale rather than in our kind of day-to-day relationships, where it's also applicable. But on a wider scale, we have to look at where the source of facts are coming from, what narratives we're given, and if there are any agendas that can distort that, right? All of this is there's nothing inherently bad with looking for narrative truths. We need people to be doing so. It is essential. I'm a big believer in the fourth estate. I'm a believer in journalists holding the powerful accountable, for example. But what we're facing in the age of information and social media and polarization is the real fracturing of the illusion of a single consensus, narrative, truth. In days gone by, there was almost a overseer or an institution that would provide a narrative, be it the church, be it the government, be it reputable news sources. Now we can go anywhere and we can find our own version of events, and it can match our idea of reality. It can match our own yearning to find some kind of truth. Again, looking for truth in this way is admirable. There's nothing inherently wrong. But what I want to bring attention to is the truth-seeking impulse. That is what Carl Jung would call the religious impulse. It's the part of us that just has a sense that there's something more, that we have to kind of uncover truth. What we see today is this truth-seeking impulse projected into finding narrative truths, often from global events where we ultimately do not have any control over where the information is coming from. It could be that we uncover research, that we uncover information that is valuable, that contradicts a mainstream narrative, but ultimately, when we channel the truth-seeking impulse into narrative, we unconsciously attempt to find the truth, the true nature of reality in a story. But as Rumi says, silence is the language that God speaks, all else is a poor translation. So when we look at truth-seeking from a spiritual perspective, we're actually looking for the embodiment and the experience of truth. This is known as Satya. This is the truth that is embodied and experienced at a different state of awareness. Satya as an experience is part of the fabric of the absolute, of universal consciousness, of Brahman. It's something that is experienced in meditation and is something that is beyond language. Only when we direct our attention to self-enquiry do we connect with the ability to perceive truth directly. Now you can see the problem here, because in the 2021, right, we have to be able to balance both. If you're a truth seeker, if you're someone who's looking earnestly to develop yourself spiritually, right, there is a necessity to not only experience spiritual truth and to start the process of self-inquiry, and that involves removing all the storylines and the beliefs that you have, not only about the world and the models that you apply to the world, but also to your image of self. So self-inquiry is a really challenging process, because in that light of pure awareness, that truthful light of pure awareness, all falsehood falls away. That's one way of saying that when we are aware of the thinking mind, the conceptual frameworks start to dissolve. And it's only what's left. It's only what's left once they've dissolved that we understand as a form of truth. But we have to be able to balance this with also having a reasoned, logical, and rational worldview that complies with the conceptual worldview that the majority of people have. And this is our challenge, is to understand that essentially these realities are illusions, that they're not coherent, that there are many different realities competing to be the reality. But if we can balance the understanding of Satya, and through that the wisdom and the compassion and the love, and then channel that through our desire to arrive at a narrative truth, we find that we're not attached. We're not attached to applying the truth-seeking impulse to narrative. And what I mean by that is, if we're not connected to our spiritual truth, if we're looking to the external to understand the nature of reality, we become really caught up in the competing narratives. So we see kind of one line of thinking and we grab hold of it. It could be that we develop a belief that crystallizes, and then we don't want to receive any information that competes against that. We might have a particular political viewpoint and we argue against anyone who has a different view. All this does is serves to crystallize and create a sense of rigidity around the ego, if confused with reality, if confused with our sense of identity. So it's just a pointer to know what game you're playing. If you're looking for truth, the actual truth that comes through a spiritual practice, the truth that comes from self-enquiry, it has to be directed within. It's an esoteric process, right? It's a process, and by that I mean eso as in within, from the Greek within. It's a process of looking within, not an exoteric process of looking outside for answers. So to be clear, the challenge that we have and the reason there's so much confusion is because we project the truth-seeking impulse that is inherent in all of us. We all have it because we want to discover our true nature, but we project it out into the external world and we try and find that meaning, that purpose, that illumination in narrative. And by doing so, we become attached to narrative. And in doing so, we attempt to look at that narrative to tell us the fundamental nature, not only of who we are, but what our place is in the world. If we can take ownership of the truth-seeking mechanism, if we can claim the religious impulse, as Carl Jung would say, and we can apply it to ourselves, then we connect directly with truth. That doesn't mean that world events, political events, no longer matter. It doesn't mean that you no longer have to worry about narrative. It just means you can view it with equanimity. And from that place of equanimity, you can bring more calm, more reason, and a much more expansive view to the way that you understand the world and the way that you understand where other people are coming from and what realities they might be projecting onto the world, what narratives they might be attached to. If we want to move forwards, we have to understand that truth is from within and it radiates without. But that doesn't mean that the narrative, the conceptual, the structures, the agreements that we have as a society aren't important. They are. But if they're mistaken for the ultimate truth, we're going to end up really confused. We're going to end up feeling deeply unsettled and off balance anytime there's conflicting information. And ultimately, we're going to be driven further away from ourselves.